Yeah, that's exactly how I feel talking about anything pre-rotation. And that is why today we're going to go over the Fukuoka Champions League. Fukuoka. Either way. We're going to be going over the Champions League for some post-rotation stuff. I know that this video has probably been done by 1,000,001 people, but I think that it is important to transition to do here, as I absolutely refuse to be doing any more content sort of pre-rotation. I said sort of around Christmas time, I was really, really burnt out with the format that we had. I then went to EUIC and just the whole thing, I just was very down about. I played the same Toxbox deck. I really didn't want to play it. I knew the deck wouldn't perform that weekend. I felt like I'd burnt out my luck a lot over Birmingham and stuff like that. The deck just wasn't running very well the week before. However, I'd sort of spent some time testing something with the current format we have now with the Ascending Heroes, but still isn't out, weirdly, but is online. So I sort of spent some time doing that, and then it ended up being for nothing, so I ended up playing the same deck. So that annoyed me. Then I lost my winning in at EUIC, but I probably don't think that I deserved to win my winning in anyway, because I didn't play all that well throughout the day, because I was just really unbothered, and so here we are. So with sort of a complaint out of the way, I'm going to start here. We're going to go through some of the things. We're going to talk about some of the highlight points, highlight reels, some interesting facts, stats, and statistics about the Champions League. And I think it's important to note, however, that we should take all of this with a big, not a little, a big sprinkle. We're talking that Salt Bay level sprinkle of salt. Bearing in mind, this time last year, Feraligatr won this tournament. Feraligatr was hyped to be some sort of amazing one prize phenomenon coming into the Western format, and it didn't do anything. Not just a little bit, it did nothing. So I think that it's very important that a lot of the things we look at are sort of these sort of more narrow ideas of what I think they'll look like in the Western world. I also think that a lot of Japanese decks are built for best of one, therefore some of the ideas are a little bit more high roll, sort of hoping that you hit into things, and if you do, you win, if you don't, you lose, and you move on to the next game. Whereas when you're sort of playing for a best of three scenario, that's not something you want to aim and sort of try to achieve every game. You'd rather have sort of a consistent rollover of effectiveness every game. So yeah, I do think there's a big pinch of salt to be had with this, but I do think there are some really, really interesting cards and selections and everything that go quite well into the upcoming sort of format and testing. And then you'll be happy to know that sort of off the back of this, I'm going to start. I've literally got League tomorrow or today as you watch this, and I'll be recording some more tabletop showcases, and it's all going to be post-rotation stuff. I'm going to start kicking into that, and we want to make sure that this channel is the place to be for some post-rotation decks, content, all that sort of stuff. So tune in. But for now, let's get into the decks over here. So moving on over. So what's funny is I've obviously built all of this around having my webcam thing here, and Professor Benji is in white, and I've noticed that as I started sort of setting up to record. Not something I'm going to fix now, but you can see some sort of squiggles moving around the screen. It's supposed to say Professor Benji. Maybe I don't need Professor Benji written there because it's in the bottom corner as well, but it's there. So we had our winner, and our winner was Absol Box, which is quite cool just due to the fact that, EUIC, lots of people were sort of talking about maybe the last big tournament that Absol had the ability to win, just with the potential loss of Turbo Energize in the near future and stuff like that. So you sort of lose out on Nest Ball as well, to where, that helps the deck sort of flow through as well after you use that trolley. So there were some key cards that was missing, obviously not missing those yet, but it's shown here that there is sort of a different way to play it, and we just sort of get this hybrid Terra boxy E-switch sort of dot deck, where you're using the Teal Mass to sort of get that extra burst of energy instead of the Turbo Energize, and then using Absol and Kangaskhan as per to attack. Obviously that Meowth coming in, very similar to Tapu Lele, very familiar to Luminion as well, obviously being able to put that down and grab a supporter from the deck. So that's sort of the crucial card to be playing early on to make sure. I think that previously getting the Arven and the Trolley to get everything else was with the Turbo Energizer sort of the key thing. I think now we're sort of going to be relying more on like a Crispin outlet or maybe even like a Cypher Maniac and Kangaskhan early on. So that is sort of the important play you're going to make with these decks early on. But I do just think that um, in my sort of quote unquote professional opinion, I find that oftentimes when we go into new formats, it tends to early on be a lot of the already proven decks that tend to float to the top at first. We do have a huge exception to that in second place this weekend, but I do sort of find that, you know, for example, Dragapult moving into the next format, Raging Bolt moving to the next format, and as well as this Absol Box will sort of be the more consistent performers early on, just because people are already very good with those decks. So going to a large scale tournament such as this, you'd rather play a sort of a comfort thing than something a little bit more off the wall that you're trying to come up with, just because the breeding ground, you want to do well, and obviously playing something that's a little bit more proven and powerful is always the better option if you believe that to be so. So I don't think there's anything else that's too interesting about this, to be honest with you. I think that the cornerstone coming back in sort of shows that you know, now that Goldengo is gone with that sort of low punny package, was able to get through it, you're able to sort of throw this back in, and so hopefully other decks aren't sort of creating space to get around it, the decks that can't beat it, so it sort of becomes a one card counter to those things. We do now have sort of the include of Clefairy, just because you have that burst potential of Crispin now to be able to get through those Dragapults. The only thing I would say with the Clefairy that I don't really like is that there's no sort of buffing tool cards in this anymore. There's no, obviously, Bravery Charm rotating, but there's no like cape, there's no sort of any way to make it a little bit bigger. So you are sort of just trading two prizes for two prizes with the Dragapult in that matchup, just because it's got 190 HP, so Dragapult's going to be very easily able to pick that off, even without the use of something like Dust Noir. So I do think there's things that I think need ironing out with this. I do sort of question the capabilities of the deck under item lock as well. I know that you have Crispin, but you need to draw into it naturally. Obviously, if you're not sort of being able to stack that with Kangaskhan early game and stuff, which I guess is why the Cypher Maniacs is important. But I feel that this doesn't sort of have the same smoothness, maybe, as the Turbo Energize had. Two key things that I do want to note, though, is obviously the Teal Mask does make that sort of the late game unfair stamp use on you maybe a little bit more smooth. You have some grass energy to get out of that, as well as Kangaskhan's error running, so potentially not as susceptible to the high count of unfair stamp. And then that is the second thing I wanted to mention, is those unfair stamps. They're going to be popping up a lot in this video, and it seems that the lack of disruption through Iono going is being very hard replaced, should I say, not just soft replaced, with the unfair stamp. So a lot of decks playing this as any sort of disruption. Otherwise, I do feel the format would sort of lean more towards aggressive archetypes, things that sort of go boom very quickly, Raging Bolt being one of them that performed quite well this weekend, but Unfair Stamp sort of trying to give you the opportunity not to be completely run over by those decks. So I don't necessarily agree with this. I think that it's a must, not a want. I feel like you need to feel like you have some sort of disruption to try and get in the game. I think especially paired with Absol, it's obviously really strong. But I do think decks would much prefer to play some of those aspects that are more closely aligned to the type of archetype it is, those prime catches, the maximum belts, so on and so forth. But I think that early on, you don't want to be caught out with Unfair Stamp and not being able to do it back. So I think for now we're going to see that. But I think as the format grows on, I think that they'll start to be replaced with other things as people sort of try to figure out ways to make the decks a little bit more consistent. So after that, we come into probably the biggest shock for everyone this weekend, which was Arbelieve EX. Now, I remember watching a video that Azul did a couple of months ago where he was playing Arbelieve with Dust Noir. So if there was any possible way of this card being somewhat relevant at a tournament, I thought it would just be someone copycatting and piggybacking off that. But it seems that I was completely wrong, and this was sort of bred out of the weekend. One thing I will say about this deck is I do think this is going to be one of those occasions where I don't think this translates quite well. I think that there are stronger and more effective grass type attackers in the format. I do think that Mega Venusaur deserves a nice shout, and I do think that once you sort of iron out some of the teething problems of Mega Meganium, figure out a way to sort of move the energy a little bit more effectively than E-Switch, maybe we're just waiting for a card to be able to do that, then I think that those cards will sort of take over precedent. I think that sort of Mega Venusaur maybe allows for you to play a little bit wider of an array of attackers and sort of strategies. This does seem very linear in its approach. It's sort of either hit hard with Ogerpon or snipe with Arbelieve. Neither are bad strategies whatsoever, obviously proved by this getting as far as it did, but I do think that maybe just based on what the card does and the fact that it's seen absolutely no success so far in the Western world or even Japan before this, sort of maybe shows that there isn't that much power behind the deck. I do think it's helped a lot by Meowth, just it being allowing you to be able to find those Dawns exactly when you need them. I think previously you, in sort of the grass decks, you needed to play a split amount of draw support, so maybe find your forests and stuff like that, but then also on the flip side playing Dawn, so you're not always going to hit what you need at the right time. But the Meowth's definitely helping that. But I do think that, you know, we're coming into a format where Unfair Stand becomes a big thing, and so low to the ground decks, basic decks that hit hard, are sort of maybe going to become a little bit more prevalent in the meta. And so if you're going to play stage 2s, I think that we need ways to cheat them into play, whether that be through a forest or something more cheesy like a Grimsley, or you know, a Pokemon like Gabite that's going to get those Garchomps into play for you and search for them. I just think otherwise everything might just be a little bit too slow. Dragapult being the exception to this, just with the fact that it has so much burst potential and using Dusknoirs to sort of come from behind, should I say, and sort of take multi-prize turns in that regard. But I do think apart from that, we're going to go through a little period here where sort of stage 2s aren't at the forefront of the format, which could be refreshing. They have sort of dominated for a long time now, so we'll sort of see where that ends us up. But I do think that there's not an awful lot to say about this. I don't want to sit here and sort of go through and critique every card in it like I know exactly what is going on here, as it's sort of the first time I have seen this deck full stop, let alone sort of variations of it. I do think that sort of grass types, now me personally, I'm looking at Mega Venusaur as the deck I'm sort of going to lean into early on into this format. I just think it's got some great options, and grass type to me seems like the most optimal type to be. I think that when formats come by, there's always sort of a most optimal type to be in order to play into the meta and counter what is good. And I think right now that tends to be grass. I think that Mega Absol falling to it. I think that there's not very much fire going to be played. Chi-Yu is going to be rotating as sort of like an easy setup thing for any of those sort of burst decks with Zard. Zard obviously itself going. So I do think the grass sort of doesn't suffer any falls in its weakness, but also is able to trade up into, you know, your Absols, your Garchomps, so on and so forth as well. So I do think that's really important to note. But again, that Unfair Stamp coming out. So top 4, as I mentioned, we sort of see a funky version of Dragapult here, and this is what I mean by the options that it has. We see that Mega Kangaskhan for the extra draw, the Dracloaks, and we're back to sort of that Monkey Dory and Crispin build. Now, lots of people mentioning that, you know, the loss of some of the really, really effective cards that Dragapult's had in the past may sort of bring the deck down a couple of notches. However, I think the deck is going to be stronger than it's ever been, to be honest with you. There's not a lot that can stand in its way now with Gardevoir going. I think that, you know, obviously the loss of Iono and Countercatcher does sort of stop you from making some more trapping and sort of more obvious spread plays. However, I do feel that, you know, with things like Meowth to grab exactly what you need when you need it, while sort of pushing forward these big stage 2 Pokemon for only 2 prizes. You've got to imagine now that a lot of the stage 2s that are going to be being played are Megas, giving up 3, and so Dragapult's sort of the exception to that mold right now and only taking 2 prizes every time you knock one out. And I think that, you know, I was always a big fan when Dragapult was a little bit quicker, and you had that sort of burst potential of the Crispin or the rare candies to sort of really punish your opponent early on and take controls again, grab it by the scruff of the neck and run it over the line. And I think that these new sort of iterations of Dragapult are able to do that, you know, especially with something like an unfair stamp as well. Maybe instead of a rare candy and a push with the Crispin early game to take the game by the scruff of the neck, you're sort of aiming for that later on in the game. You're going to be grabbing something up into the active. You're going to be unfair stamping. You're going to be getting rid of that and maybe sniping something for a knockout on the bench, 3-4 prizes, and passing it back over to your opponent, and just know that, you know, you've got your cloaks, you've got draws, you've got a big stage 2 in the active, and can you respond? And the answer more often than not is going to be no, as you know, Dragapult sort of goes back to having that no weakness, bar Clefairy sort of giving it problems now. And you know, guardies aren't going to be popping up in the room everywhere, so the likelihood of you sort of just succumbing to that very quickly is much lower. I do think the other thing to note is that we're seeing Clefairies pop up in Dragapult decks. Now that it's playing that Crispin, you do sort of have a low to the ground way to sort of beat your opponent off of the ball as well. You can see in this list there's no Blood Moon Ursaluna, and I think that that Clefairy sort of taken that place as a late game attacker that can get through a lot of sort of smaller basics, you know, get through those, but especially with the area 0, being able to expand your board wide, get through that, but then as well being able to use that in the mirror to take big knockouts. So one to keep your eye on. I think that we're going to see a number of different builds already in this video, but I think that over the expansion of the format and as we go, like, Dragapult will change 1,000,001 times. It has in the past. We've had Dragapult, Slowpolt, Rare Candy Pult, back down again to Slowpolt, and now we're somewhere in the middle, you know, and I think that we'll sort of see a similar thing here. So coming over to the other top 4 deck, and this is one that I'm actually a really big fan of. I've never really been a big Raging Bolt fan, but I think that I like the adaptability that the deck almost towards the end of the format we're in now was already becoming this deck, because it was playing less Sada, more Crispin, and sort of trying to have those big knockouts on board as opposed to sort of stringing big combos together from the discard pile and stuff like that. You're obviously semi-reliant on the Knockdown engine, but that almost made getting the pieces together very easily, as there was always more Crispins in deck. There was always ways to get the energy back into hand, Glass Trumpet to get it back on the board from the discard, so on and so forth. So I think that the deck was almost already morphing into this. However, now we're in a position where there's far less hand disruption. Obviously, you do have Unfair Stamp, but we're looking at a deck with Knockdowns that you can potentially sort of rip off the top of the Unfair Stamp. It does obviously rely on a bit of luck, but you do have that available, as well as still having Pheasantipity. And then you've got the Teal Mask. You know, all you need is to draw into Grass Energy with a Pheasantipity. You can put that onto a Teal Mask, and all of a sudden we're drawing 4, 5, 6 cards over the course of our turn to try and get us out of that Unfair Stamp. So I think that if there's a low to the ground deck that requires very minimal operation in order to do the things it needs to do, then it is going to be this. And then, of course, one of the big boasts for this type of deck is that it can sort of go through some of those bigger megas in one hit and take 3 prizes all in one go. We've seen it a million times. The deck is very, very similar to what it looks like now. You can see that support account. It's absolutely tiny, to be honest with you. 4 Crispin, 1 Lily, 1 Boss. Like, when have we ever seen a support account like that before, right? But the deck is literally saying to you, I grab what I need off Knockdown, and I don't need a lot. All I need is the energy to take a knockout every turn. And you know, that's what we're going to see here from it. I do think one thing I was sort of anticipating a little bit from Raging Bolt going into post-rotation was actually the use of Team Rocket Spidops. Just because, as I said, Grass, in my opinion, becomes a little bit more relevant. There seems to be quite a lot that's important in the format with Grass Weakness. It sort of gives that 1 prize option again, sort of thing, and the charge up the energy for the Raging Bolt, as I just felt that you know, there's a lot less hand disruptions where you've got time to sort of get those little pieces down, the Tarantulas and the Spidops and so on and so forth. So I'll be interested to see if that actually comes off and comes to fruition. It could just be a crazy idea in my head, but try that if you want to as well. Just make sure to give me credit. But yeah, I think that, you know, this is definitely not going anywhere. I do think we'll continue to see Raging Bolt crop up, especially in the early parts of post-rotation. Again, just because it is a deck that knows what it wants to do, and it's very, very good at doing it, and Crispin at the forefront of that. So, going down to our top 8, we have Crustal. So I actually think Crustal again, always sort of a pain in everyone's side, a thorn in everyone's side, should I say. It's something you do have to be wary of. And again, I think that we sort of saw, can't remember if it was rotation last year or maybe a little bit after that, but we sort of saw a lot of these Warland decks, the Milotics, the Cornerstones and stuff like that, the Farigaraths, were sort of doing well very early on. And in my humble opinion, when people are trying to figure out what the best 60 for a deck is early on, they're not so worried about finding tech options for things like Crustal, for things like Cornerstone, Milotic, so on and so forth. So they'll sort of fall by the wayside a little bit because everyone's minds is a little bit on how can I be more consistent and how do I beat the bigger decks in the room. And if I hit mill or stall or something like Crustal, unfortunately this time round I'm going to have to take the loss. And I think that once sort of the seeds are sowed for those decks and we sort of get those 50 to 55 cards of where the deck's going to be, you can then start to see those additional things added in to make sure that you don't lose to this. But as I said, pinch of salt, I don't think this will sort of have large finishes similar to this format. I do think that people will make day two, there'll be deep runs and stuff like that, because all you got to do is hit the right matchups right and hope that people don't have the answers. But I can't see this becoming sort of like a mainstay in our format now and it becoming really good all of a sudden. The one thing I will give to it is the Pheasantipity is a really cool idea with the Monkey Dory on board as well, and you can sort of make it to where your opponent's flipping and not take any prizes with that. That's quite interesting as well as a sort of a secondary attacker in the matchup if your Crustals aren't getting set up. And I do really like the Team Rockets Articuno as well. So what I didn't realise until sort of looking at the card is it's actually a really nice counter to Alakazam, and just by having it in the active and it can't be touched, then Alakazam can't really do a lot. So, a deck like this would end up losing to something like Alakazam as it has no problem getting through any of your cards and its damage counters as well. So, there's not a lot that can be done to sort of combat that from this deck. And so Articuno seems to be a thing that's popped up a couple of times in order to beat that. So I'm not going to dwell on this for too long as I don't think it's going to be a big deal in the format. And then we come to sort of our next Dragapult list, and already you're seeing it's a different thing altogether. We have the Ghost back in this one. It's going to be looking to be a little bit more aggressive. We're sort of offsetting that double Latias Budu from the other deck and trying to lock that to just a higher count of Budu and hoping to draw into it. Seeing no Latias in here is a little bit concerning to me, but then we do have room to fit the 1/1 Knockdown in, as much as I do think, obviously Knockdown an absolutely fantastically strong card, but you're not able to use it until your Dragapult's out. I know there's 3 rare candy, but I think that part of getting that candy out would require you to use Noctowl to sort of grab the candy and create this big combo. So it seems a little bit convoluted to me and maybe a little bit backwards and counterintuitive. I'd much prefer to see maybe another Terra and the Crispins for early game, and then the use of Knockdown, similar to sort of Terrazard. So I'm unsure how much I actually like this deck. I'm sitting here talking about a top 8 deck from Fukuoka. They've done absolutely fantastically. Please, I'm probably completely incorrect, as I very often am. But I just think me looking at this, it seems a little bit like you need to be a little bit fortuitous with sort of the way that you receive your cards throughout the game. Your sort of recon directives need to sort of come in the right order, and you need to see the Hoot Hoot before you see the Knockdown to make sure that you've got space for the Hoot Hoot. We haven't got a vastness of bench space like we did in sort of the Area Zero build that we saw up ahead. So it seems very sort of, you got to get your Hoot Hoot down. Is it for a specific matchup? And then if you've got Hoot Hoot down, it means you can only have, 2 Dracloaks down and 1 Dusclops, and then, your Meowth or your Fez that you've used early on. It just seems very, I don't know, it seems weird to me. But I do like the include Briar. I think that in a deck where you've maybe lost a little bit of that disruptiveness in counter catcher, Iono and stuff like that, this is another way to sort of pull back games you sort of don't really have any right being in still. So, sort of forcing your opponent down to the 2 prizes as well with things like Dust Noir. You can sort of manipulate Briar quite nicely, similar to Hazard used to do. So that's really cool to see, and I'm interested to see how many sort of Dust Noir / Terror decks continue to play that in the future. So moving on from that to another one. Now, this is sort of a lot more what I imagine when I see a Dragapult list. You know, you have got that Latias in there, you've got the multiple copies of Buddy, you've got the disruptiveness of the Unfair Stamp, you've got the Blood Moon for late game. Now, bearing in mind, I absolutely do not mind the Clefairy from above. As I mentioned, it's a little bit strange where it comes into that 2-for-2 trade, but I think Blood Moon as well, another really good attacker to sort of be paired with those 3 bosses in this deck. As we mentioned, the Losser Counter Catcher, a little bit heavier reliant on boss now, and then, you know, the unfair stance with the Jamming Towers in combination and tandem can sort of create some awkward board states and ways for your opponent to try and win the game later on. And then the Risky Ruins as well is quite interesting. I think Hawlucha is actually a really big loss for Dragapult. I think that maybe one of the more underrated cards in Archetypes leaving. Obviously, Dragapult had such a nice time sort of being able to get over to that 70 HP mark. And Buddy Buddy Poffin now sort of seems a lot more safe to be playing and throwing down Pokemon in that sort of mid to late game, knowing that Dragapult can't really get over it unless they pop Ghost and Snipe at the same time. So I think that yeah, it's quite an interesting include. You know, you do have the monkeys and stuff to move the damage, but I think that it's not as instant as Hawlucha, right? I think that that was a really, really good card for the deck. So the Risky Ruins, I imagine, sort of trying to make up for that a little bit, as well as being able to generate your own damage for monkeys, whatever side it is, it doesn't matter, you know, as long as you have that damage to move over and to take the extra snipes. But yeah, the Risky Ruins are really, really interesting include. And then, as we mentioned already, the Crispins, this deck sort of fully leaning into that now, making sure you've got plenty of energy in play. You know, plenty on your monkeys, on your Dragapults, and then, of course, being able to sweep up with Blood Moon later in the game. So this is sort of my idea of what I thought the deck would sort of look like going into post-rotation. I did think there would be a bigger include of ghosts and stuff like that as well, but I do see the appeal of maybe a little bit straighter, a little bit more consistent of a build without having to worry about the ghost. So maybe just using Monkey Dory to get rid of some smaller threats on the bench, some of those evolving threats and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see just how much of that we see and whether later on in the format the Dust Noir package becomes the more popular way to play, which I think it will once it comes to the Western world, but it's interesting for now. And I think probably the fan favourite, the Heroes Champion of the weekend. I think that coming into the Team Rockets cards, I think everyone wanted them to be a lot better than they were. And I do think, you know, I think it would have been annoying if they were like really oppressive and everyone was just sort of like shoehorned into playing these Rocket supporters and sort of the same decks. But I think everyone wanted them to be a little bit better than they were, just because in the theme of Pokemon, I mean, who doesn't love Team Rocket, right? Growing up, the bad guys, and who doesn't love the bad guys in sort of any iconic franchise, right? So I think that it's cool now that we sort of have a alternative option. I do think Mewtwo does come up in stock in this format for sure, but it does seem that this is sort of the better deck sort of early on. Maybe the blueprint a little bit easier to come up with right now, you know, knowing that you just need those Honchkrows, the Porygons, and then a shitload of supporters, right? So I think that yeah, it's definitely cool to see in that regard the Team Rocket stuff. I mean, there's not too much for me to say about this. It's you know, it's a cool one prize deck. Always a big fan of sort of a variation of different prize decks, whether you have one prize decks that are efficient but not as strong versus 3 prize decks that are very strong but not very efficient prize rise, and then that's sort of like those 2 prizes sitting somewhere in the middle. I really like that sort of the vastness and sort of the upward trend of a format. Really big fan of. So it's always great to see that sort of different variations of prize types are doing well. And so you know, long live Honchkrow. I think that, you know, whether it be Honchkrow, something else, I think it's always important to have something in that place for you to sort of be wary of as a multi-prize deck. One thing I do want to note is the Miracle headset. Headset. Getting 2 supporters out of the discard. I think that not an A spec that has been used anywhere else, a double VS Seeker, but for sure something that is very, very strong on this deck. I mean, you know, absolutely, the synergy is perfect, right? So one of the only times you don't really want to be unfair stamping, which is quite funny because the deck itself is quite susceptible to unfair stamps. So you most definitely don't want to be unfair stamping your hand if your opponent can't seem to get rid of it right now. I mean, if you prize your unfair stamp against this deck, I mean, it's pretty much gone to the races. I don't think there's a lot you can really do against it, apart from hope they miss energy, right? But yeah, I think a really interesting archetype. I think that the inconsistencies of playing that many supporters will definitely come out and will definitely bite back in some games. But as I mentioned, in a best of one, I think that you're happy to sort of take that risk and roll with the punches and just sort of say, okay, cool, didn't get it that game, move on to the next round, you know? So yeah, I think a really, really cool archetype. I think, again, that Articuno sort of making sure you can keep at bay the other one prize deck in the format in Alakazam. And then moving on, right after I said it, there we go, there's our Mewtwo. And sort of, you know, I don't want to dwell too long on this either because very similar things. I think that this deck sort of has a multitude, where I sort of mentioned that it's good to have decks throughout the format with sort of an upward trend of all the different prize types. This deck does it all within one thing. You have the Mewtwo for the big one-hit knockouts, those big 280 damage hits with the max belt obviously getting a little bit higher. Then you have the Mimikyu to copy sort of your Dragapults and everything else, Terra Pokemon's attacks and sort of do those back as a one prizer. You know, that combined with Clefairy, you can go straight through a Dragapult sprinkle on the bench. As much as it's got 60 HP, so it's a little bit dodgy because you can sort of get into a 3-prize turn if they boss at the Clefairy and take both. So I don't know just how effective that is. And then, of course, you got the Spidots I mentioned. Spidots previously. I think the grass is in a really, really strong place right now. So I think being able to get those Spidots down and actually do quite a lot of damage for weakness to some of these things like Absol, Garchomp, so on and so forth, is actually quite crucial to the deck's success. I think that maybe if it was just Mewtwo on its own, it wouldn't sort of have that to boast. But I think with sort of the include of two, not one, but two pretty good and pretty efficient one prize attackers, I think the deck does pick up a little bit more legs. I think the only thing I would like to see in this deck that you can't really play is the use of Forest of Vitality. I know that obviously the Rocket's Warehouse is really important to the deck, obviously being able to draw off the back of those supporters, but I just think the burst potential of potentially late game, the burst potential of potentially, the burst potential potentially allowing you to sort of late game, your opponent thinks they've wiped your board and you just got to go Tarantula, Spidops, charge up, attach, you know, Giovanni knockout, I think is quite cool to think about, you know, and you could even chuck in, you know, like another cheeky grass line in here, you know, just to sort of throw people off guard. But I guess if you start it, you don't really want that, right? But maybe just like a one-off Forest of Vitality and stuff like that, just to sort of throw things off and get that Spidops into play sort of thing. Because I do think that lots of opponents will try and beat this deck by sort of chasing after the Spidopses and hoping you can't charge up the energy you need. And that would be a really good way to counteract that. But apart from this, I think it's an interesting thing, and long live Team Rocket, as, you know, always cool. So, oh, that was actually top 16. So we'll actually go through a couple. You know, we're not going to look at another Dragapult. I think this is definitely interesting. Did well at EUIC as well. The only thing that I don't like with this deck is that it seems very one-trick pony on the first turn. I feel like if you do miss that Joltik, you're a lot less able to sort of draw out of it than maybe some of the other Noctowl builds, and the combo potential's a little bit more difficult. You know, you're charging that energy back with Joltik, but then it all sort of goes on the first attack, and then you're very much relying on sort of drawing into those Crispins when you don't have a lot of on-board draw to get that back out. And then because you're Jolticking, you're taking a bunch of energy out of the deck straight away, so your Crispins could become really short quite quickly, and there's not an awful lot of way to, no, there's no way to get energy back in the deck. You've only got the energy retrieval there as well. So I don't know how I feel about this very much. Obviously, it's got some nice options. It's got the same options, obviously, as Raging Bolt has right now with the Teal Mask and the Wellspring, but I think I prefer the other version, though, to be fair. So do that. Terrabox, never been a fan of Terrabox. So skip over that. And I think that one thing I do definitely want to touch on is the fighting packages. Now, I think that one thing a lot of people were maybe a little bit disappointed with going into the weekend is that everyone has been sort of hoping for the removal of Guardi, should I say, for Lucario to sort of stamp its imprint on the format. It's already boasted some pretty good finishes at a lot of regionals, but sort of maybe falling eventually to a Gardevoir or being able to dodge Gardevoir to get that far. And that sort of does highlight the main weakness of the deck, which is its weakness. But I think everyone thought this deck would perform a little bit better than it did. I'm quite surprised to see top 16 be the highest it finished. Maybe the deck just needs that ironing out. Like, I mean, already in the two that we see here, you see two different ace specs, one playing the belt, one playing the scoop up. So maybe it is a case of that ironing out, playing monkey, whereas the other sort of opting for more of the special fighting energies, which I'm pretty sure are missed energies, if I'm not mistaken, pretty much missed, like sort of stopping effective attack. So I think that, one leaning into the Hariyama a little bit more for the gust and stuff like that, whereas the other just going for sort of a more natural count of boss. Yeah, maybe that's the thing. I'm not fully sort of in the know of what the best 60 is right now. Obviously, we'll be working on some of that over the next coming weeks, but yeah, I think everyone was surprised not to see more out of this, and I think between this and Cynthia's Garchomp fighting should definitely have a place somewhere in this format, especially now that Guardi's gone. So hopefully for those fighting type lovers, they do sort of pull it together and get something going. But that's it. Like, I mean, I don't want to cover too long. I don't want to make the video sort of 10 days long. Everyone's probably seen these decks. I just wanted to sort of go over my thoughts. And I think the bullet points is that unfair stamp now, but maybe not so much later. I think that while everyone is a little bit worried about there being no disruption, especially over sort of best of threes, I think when it comes to the Western world, unfair stamp will be everywhere as well, just because the use of unfair stamp over a best of three will probably be better than a best of one. You use it didn't come off in the game, you've already lost in best of one, whereas sort of you'd hope that if it didn't come off the first time, it would probably come off, second, third time in a best of three. So there's that. I think that grass is in a really, really strong place right now, and I think that as you have seen on this channel, I sort of like to tunnel vision a little bit onto archetypes and sort of come up with the best idea I can before I move to something else. So Venusaur is where I am right now. Well, Venusaur Meganium, I should say. It's sort of a hybrid deck. So that's where I am right now. So I do think that's sort of what I'm providing to the format is I think the strength of grass is sort of undeniable. I think that Dragapult will sort of be all over the place for a little bit, lots of different variations of it until we sort of get a big finish from someone like a Henry Brand, a Tord, an Azul, someone like that to sort of go, okay, this is where we want to hang our hat for a little bit. This is the archetypes that's doing well. This is the 60 that has sort of performed the best. So we'll hang our hat here for a little bit until someone else, and then Alberto Conte comes around or something like that and changes it again, So I think that's the way that Dragapult's always sort of operated, and I think we'll continue to see that. And I think that Team Rockets, I think maybe one of the only decks with sort of inbuilt disruption between Archer and maybe playing your own unfair stamp as well. So is that enough to make it an archetype on its own? I actually think it might be at this point, with such a lack, Judge and Harlequin being really, really weak cards. I think that judging yourself in a game to four can almost feel worse than doing it to your opponent, depending on your setup or the type of deck. I mean, if you're playing a stage 2 or a combo deck, the last thing you want to be doing is judging yourself that low of a hand early on. And then I think that, being shoehorned into playing unfair stamp, I mean, doesn't feel good for anyone, especially if it doesn't sort of align with the core of your deck very well. Like aggressive decks playing unfair stamp just feels really weird instead of playing something like a prime catcher or something. So I think there's a lot to be discovered yet, but I do think obviously Archer may be a reason to play Rockets on his own right now. I think that being able to disrupt a little bit is something that seems very important in this format. And there was one more thing I was going to say. Oh, that was it. I think this is our crystal here is our pinch of salt moment. It's our Feraligatr moment. It's the wars from last year moment. I just think that right now, no one is thinking about trying to counter this deck. I don't think that anyone is sort of trying to come up with ways to make sure they don't lose to Millstore. I think they're very much focused on how do I beat the best decks in format. So I can't see this being a consistent performer throughout our time in our first rotation format. But I am Professor Benji. This is another episode of the Top Cut Academy with Professor Benji. I hope you've enjoyed. And as I said, later on this week, I will bring in some post-rotation stuff. And I have sort of a little challenge planned as well that will sort of be our first little bit of non-competitive content just on the Professor Benji brand as opposed to the Top Cut Academy brand. So I hope you're looking forward to that as well. I know I am. But for now, thank you very much for watching. And I will see you in post-rotation world. Adios. Peace out.